Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Houghton. I'm a public historian, author and broadcaster. Now, if you think you know Christopher Wren, then think again. He was born in 1632 and is remembered as the most English of all England's architects. And today, I hope to change your mind just a little so that you can think of him as something completely else. Wren was far, far more than an architect. He was an anatomist, a mathematician, a navigator, and an astronomer, all before becoming England's best-known architect. He was also a founding member of the Royal Society. He held a chair at Gresham College and was a member of Parliament. He was also a husband, a father, and a widower twice over. He was a courtier. He was a man who, in his 90-year-long life, which is incredible considering the age, not his age, the age, experienced struggles and tragedy. To some, he was almost a deity. To all, me included, he was probably the first virtuoso. With so many facets to his life and character, it's not likely that we will ever truly know Wren the man. But we can absolutely appreciate him as a person who was as complex as the beautiful brick, stones, and mortar that he left behind. Legend has it, and I love this story, that during the construction of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, Wren, obviously as chief architect, would often visit the site and engage in conversation with the labourers and the workers, something that architects really didn't do at that particular moment in history. On one occasion, he encountered a worker who was carving a tiny mouse on a piece of the cathedral. Wren, amused by this unexpected addition, asked the worker why he was carving a mouse. And the worker replied, "Because, sir, the cat is already carved," suggesting that a cat had also been included in another part of the building. I love that. This playful story actually adds a real touch of humour to Wren's legacy and highlights the actual camaraderie that could exist between the architect and the workers if you were prepared to put the effort in, especially involved in the construction of this monumental structure. And I think the idea that even, in the serious business of designing and constructing grand buildings, there's actually always room for a bit of whimsy. Wren is the man. There's absolutely no one quite like him. I don't think there ever was before him, and I don't think there's been anyone like him since. But let's start at the beginning, because most people think of Wren as the man who just designed, and I say that tongue-in-cheek, St. Paul's Cathedral. They think of him as an architect. But he didn't actually become an architect until he was in his mid-30s. So I would like us to rewind just a little and consider what he'd been doing up until that time. Professor Adrian Tinniswood, OBE, FSA, is an English writer and historian. He's currently Professor of English Social History at the University of Buckingham, and he is my guest today, a friend of Rearview Mirror Chronicles. Author of no fewer than 18 books on social and architectural history, Professor Tinniswood has also worked with the National Trust and is an expert on Sir Christopher Wren. He's also written an amazing book about him titled His Invention So Fertile, A Life of Christopher Wren. Professor, welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
I know that he grew up during the English Civil War when Oliver Cromwell was Lord Protector of England, but can you give me some sort of insight and a sense of Wren and his family during these turbulent times?
He's born on 20th of October 1632 in East Noyle, where his father is rector. He's not born in the rectory because there's just been a fire there. So the family moved out to a cottage in the village. But his father is a clergyman. His uncle is a Laudian clergyman. They've both been quite close to Lancelot Andrewes, who's part of Archbishop Laud's circle. They're high church, both of them. And they're both quite important. His father becomes Dean of Windsor. His uncle Matthew becomes Bishop of Ely. They're in the forefront of that beauty of holiness, if you like. And there's no doubt that Wren should and would have gone into the church in a world that wasn't turned upside down. But when the Civil War breaks out, his father's ejected from East Noyle and also from Windsor. His uncle Matthew gets thrown in the Tower, where he stays for 18 years. And the church doesn't seem that good an option for a young man in the 1640s. He's very bright, he's very delicate, he's basically a mathematician, this is what he does. Mathematicians weren't invented in the 1640s, but if they were, that's what he would have been. He dabbles with making things like sundials, mechanical problems and mathematical problems. He's interested in the stars, he's interested in how things work. And it's from there he starts to move in with a circle of experimental philosophers, people who are influenced by Bacon's Solomon's House, by the New Atlantis, by the whole idea of checking out the world rather than accepting ancient authorities. Look for yourself, see what the world does, and experiment. Have a hypothesis, test it, and then thesis. Wren's part of that, and it seems like it's ordinary for us today. It was revolutionary in the 1640s. People didn't do that. They accepted that there were centaurs, there were unicorns. They're still struggling to work out if the Earth actually moves around the sun or not. And a lot of people in Wren's childhood don't believe it does. So he's right at the forefront of the scientific revolution, and he's in his teenage years.
In his teenage years? That's astounding. What that really points to is changing attitudes to knowledge and learning in his youth, because that sense of experimentation as a method proceeding sort of underpins how he is able to study such a vast array of subjects, seemingly all at one time. Do you think that's the heart of him, the heart of it? Because he becomes a virtuoso in a way that I can't even imagine anyone being so today.
Yeah. Wren knows everything in a world where it is possible to know everything. And then he finds out more. He's remarkably bright as a teenager. But the group he's moving with, people like William Harvey, who's just posited the idea of the circulation of the blood, Charles Scarborough, who becomes the king's physician, who he lodges with in London, who introduces him to a circle including, eventually, John Wilkins, the Warden of Wadham, Seth Ward, Professor of Astronomy, Robert Boyle, the weird, neurasthenic, brilliant young man who settled in Oxford. He moves with this group, and their idea is that the world is a problem to solve. It's a question to be answered. And those people that he's mixing with, when most of them are actually a generation older than him, but it's a mark of how bright he was, I think, that he's accepted that miracle of a youth. I think John Evelyn calls him the extraordinary genius. Everybody thinks that this kid is not only their equal, he's better than them at what they do, which is quite remarkable, I think.
Yeah, it's remarkable, truly remarkable. And to give some sense of how this is being recognised at this time, he's actually graduated from Magdalen College, Oxford. He's been made a Fellow of All Souls, Oxford. And guys, just in case you don't know, the entrance exam for All Souls College, Oxford, has been called the hardest exam in the world. And it's not because this requires, an advanced knowledge of, say, differential geometry or anything like that. It's because the questions are totally out of left field and there's actually no wrong or right answers. Interesting, huh? Anyway, back to Wren. So in his 20s, he makes his first career move outside Oxford, and he becomes a professor of astronomy at Gresham College in London. And of course, Gresham is still in existence today. I mean, can you imagine how smart this guy is to have been a professor in his early 20s? But what did that role involve? And do you think this is Wren really kind of moving leaps and bounds from his contemporaries at Oxford without really trying that hard?
He's been engaged at Oxford in all kinds of things. He's been engaged in astronomy. His interest in astronomy is primarily mathematical, I think. He makes telescopes. He makes a brass model of Saturn showing Saturn's rings. He doesn't quite get it right. He thinks the rings touch the planet up 2 points. But nevertheless, it's the first time anyone has suggested that Saturn has rings. He's the first person in the world to perform a canine splenectomy. Dogs didn't do too well in the 1650s in Oxford, but he injects an opiate into the back leg of a spaniel and the dog gets stoned. Therefore, the poison, if you like, the drug circulates around the body. But he has a reason for doing it. He's the first person, as far as we know, to perform a canine splenectomy. I really mean that dogs did not do well in 1650s Oxford. A canine splenectomy without benefit of anaesthetic is a little bit ooky. But he doesn't do that for fun. He does that because no one is quite sure what the spleen is doing in the system. And he suggests that if an animal can do without it, then it's not doing all that much. The dog survives. He performs the splenectomy on Robert Boyle's dog, who was promptly rechristened Spleen, which is a kind of unimaginative name. So his interests are actually medical as much as anything. And it's interesting that, to skip ahead, right at the end of his long life, he said he wishes he hadn't wasted his time in rubbish, which was his term for architecture. He wishes he'd been a physician, then he would have really made some money.
What a statement. I thought you were going to say that had he been a physician, he would have done an amazing amount of good. But he was actually paid incredibly well for his architecture. So even then, having the cash matters. So he was a founding member of the Royal Society. Why was it needed? Why was it founded in 1616? And what could it do that Gresham College couldn't do?
In a way, it's a kind of reconvening of a lot of the figures who were at Wadham and All Souls, who were a great experimental club that was in Oxford in the 1650s. And a lot of them were parliamentarians, which means they were rejected in 1660. So they started to drift into London. Wren has been made Professor of Astronomy at Gresham in 1657, where he's grappling mainly with the problem of longitude and how we measure longitude. John Wilkins, his old mentor at Wadham, is there. Seth Ward, the astronomer, is there. Robert Hooke makes an appearance slightly later on. But they're actually a group of men who share a common interest in the experimental philosophy, in seeing how things work. And you're quite right, it's after one of Wren's lectures in November 1660 that they all pile into a college room and say, let's have a club. And these 12 men, they found the Royal Society.
Yeah, and I know at this stage that Oxford was anti-experimental and very pro-religious, again, because of the Reformation, something that I compared the Beatles to in my last podcast. So this group, who formed the Royal Society, they continued to be radical in their thinking. Did this change affect Wren? And I guess what I mean by that, Professor, is did the formation of this change Wren?
The 1660s for Wren, he's not quite sure where to go, I don't think. Because shortly after the Royal Society is founded, in 1661 in fact, he leaves Gresham. He goes back to Oxford. He becomes civilian professor of astronomy at Oxford. And he drifts back and forth between Oxford and London. And he turns up at some of the Royal Society meetings and doesn't turn up at others. He's always promising to do things and never doing them. Yes, he's interested in science, in experimental science, and he remains, for most of the 1660s, astronomy is his primary interest. And it's certainly his day job. That's what he does. But two things, I think, in the early 1660s have got him thinking about architecture. One is poor old Uncle Matthew, the Bishop of Ely, who we left in the Tower of London for 18 years. He finally gets out. And as a bit of a thank offering, he suggests he would like to build a chapel at Pembroke College, Cambridge. And for reasons that are still unclear, he asks his nephew to give it a shot. He asked Wren if he will design it, which Wren does a competent job, a nice kind of faintly classical auditory box. It's a good piece of work. The other thing that draws Wren into architecture as a primary interest is Gilbert Sheldon, who was Wren's old warden at All Souls and who becomes in fairly swift succession Bishop of London, then Archbishop of Canterbury. But Sheldon offers to pay for a new theatre for graduation and other ceremonies in Oxford. And again, for reasons that we're still not absolutely clear about, Wren suggests that he'd like to have a go at doing it.
Oh, you make it sound so bizarre.
It's not as bizarre as I make it sound, because the idea of the virtuoso in 17th century could do anything. You could dabble. Most of Wren's friends designed buildings. Not many of them were built, but it's just what you did. Wren, however, with Pembroke College and then with the Sheldonian, which is a remarkable piece of work. He's untrained, remember. He doesn't know anything about architecture. He doesn't know what makes buildings stand up. And he does this fantastic job on the Sheldonian. And those two things clearly move him towards architecture, but only very gently, not exclusively. He's still Professor of Astronomy. That's what he does still. It's just that he's starting to think about how to apply mathematical principles to buildings.
So a pioneer in many ways. Both of these projects came under attack, though, architecturally speaking, but I couldn't drill down on why when I was doing my research. Why was this?
Certainly, the Sheldonian was attacked, or at least it became a sort of a statement of religious authority, as against the new science, which was questioning everything, was seen as questioning religious truths. And that made it dangerous. Robert Streeter's wonderful ceiling of the Sheldonian, with basically religious authority casting out all these troublesome other authorities. It becomes a conflict. Wren is never actually that radical. Politically, he's not radical at all. His background is royalist, solid royalist. His career will be with the Church of England.
Right.
And with the crown, with the state. He's a state architect. He's never disruptive. He's never radical in that political or ideological sense at all. He's solid right the way through. He's a consummate politician. This man will become, in 1669, he will become Surveyor General of the King's Works.
Well, I mean, the most important architectural job in the country.
The most important architectural job in the country. Just think, he gets that job and he keeps it in Charles II's reign, James II's reign, William and Mary, William, Queen Anne. He loses it with George I. That's Kissinger still being Secretary of State through 6 different administrations. He's got to have been very good at schmoozing.
Does he ever? I also wanted to ask you about his character, because we talked about, his 20s and how he doesn't follow through with things that he says he will do. He really doesn't seem to care about his reputation. And now he's in his mid-30s in the 1660s. Does that change?
Yeah, he's always starting things and leaving them, moving on to something else. He has an idea, he suggests it, he won't publish. A lot of the time it's left to Hooke, who's one of his closest with the Micrographia, for example. The impetus for the Micrographia comes from Wren. Hooke's just writing it up.
Hooke is the complete finisher, I guess, while Wren seems to be the one coming up with the ideas.
Exactly that. And if you look at the early proceedings of the Royal Society, Wren is always promising to bring in a model. He makes a model of the moon, which he gives to Charles II, which is in Charles II's private closet at Whitehall. He promises to make another one for the Royal Society, and he doesn't. And they keep asking him, and he goes, yeah, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it next week. The next meeting, I'll bring one in. And he just can't be bothered because he's moved on to the next thing, whatever that next thing is. That next thing, certainly, and the pivotal moment in Wren's career is that point in the early hours of the 2nd of September, 1666, when a baker in Pudding Lane forgets to put his oven out.
I actually think he paid someone to throw that fireball into the bakery because with the Fire of London, we wouldn't have Wren the architect and we wouldn't be talking about Wren now. But of course, that leads to St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, interestingly, the first church dedicated to St. Paul was built on the exact site by King Erkenwald back in 604 AD. Unfortunately, it would eventually be destroyed by fire as well. And then Bishop Maurice built a cathedral in exactly the same spot in 1087 AD. And this building would last for almost 600 years before being destroyed in 1666 by the Great Fire of London. The St. Paul's that you see now is Wren's magnum opus. And the context is that after the fire ravaged London, architects were actually asked to submit designs. One thing that I didn't know was how difficult the actual process was to survey the charred remains, to eventually remove all the debris and then get the designs approved and then to try and source the material and to get funding for it. It actually took decades to get built for all those reasons. So, Professor, can you give some examples of how these battles played out and how Wren managed to come out on top?
He gets St. Paul's, I think, partly, if not mainly, because Sheldon is involved and Dean Sancroft is an acquaintance, at least, of Wren. He gets it through the church all the time. The Church of England is a friend to Wren. But to start with, the building, which was in a bad state, let's not forget that 1 week before the Fire of London, Wren is on a commission to repair Old St. Paul's with Roger Pratt, who is much better qualified as an architect than Wren. And Wren, at that meeting of the commission, Wren says, let's do a dome. No one's done a dome. Let's do a dome on Old St. Paul's. And Roger Pratt says, don't be stupid, you don't know what you're talking about. And they have a fight in the middle of the nave at the cathedral.
Oh, no.
And Dean Sancroft has to pull them apart and give them a glass of wine and tell them to calm down. They'll do a proper survey. And then a week later, it burns down. except it doesn't completely burn down. So for at least a year, the idea is to repair St Paul's. And Wren actually comes up with an idea to patch it up, his first design. The building is unsafe and people are killed, in fact, up with falling rubble. And it becomes quickly apparent that they need something new. But you're right, to actually get agreement, there are 4, 5, maybe even 6 designs that Wren comes up with for St Paul's. His best is the great model, which you can still see in St Paul's today, which is a huge dome basilica, and it would have been fantastic. Wren has it completed, he has the model designed, built, so everyone can see what it's going to be like. And then the dean and chapter say, actually, we're not so sure. You think it's a bit late for them to be saying that, but it's dawned on them 2 things. One is that a great white dome basilica is too Catholic for England. The other thing is that most of them will be dead, the dean and chapter, before St Paul's is able to come into use, because the whole building needs to be domed, it needs to be finished before it can be used. Whereas a conventional cruciform cathedral, you can start at the chancel, the choir, and work backwards and use that east end while you're working backwards. Wren wept. He's not an emotional man. He's not an easy man at all. He's a very reserved person, but that's one very rare occasion where he breaks down and weeps. He begs Charles II to get involved. And Charles II doesn't want to know about that kind of thing. So Wren goes away and he gives the dean and chapter exactly what they want, a kind of Jonesian, of course the West End of St Paul's by Inigo Jones. He gives them a kind of a Jonesian replica with a melon dome on top with a kind of pagoda thing on. It's as breathtaking in its ugliness as the great model was beautiful. And the dean and chapter say, yeah, that's it, that's exactly what we want. You've nailed it. And then, famously, it's the warrant design. It goes to Charles II, who signs off the warrant, but says that any changes ornamental rather than fundamental that he wishes to make, he can make. So, in fact, he designs a completely different cathedral. People used to say he did this without the dean and chapter noticing.
How is that possible?
How is that possible? In any case, any committee any of us have ever sat on, the idea of the chair not wanting to know what's going on with the building work over a 30-year period is ridiculous. So he must have brought them with him at some point. But you're right, even knocking it down, even demolishing the ruins. There's a famous story. He brought in an engineer from the Tower of London because the crossing, they couldn't get it down, it's too solid. And the engineer puts a charge under one of the corners of the crossing and it demolishes it. The story also is that when Wren was away, his clerk of works decided he'd have a go at what was left. And he didn't need any help from any military engineers. He'd put the charge in himself. And when a chunk of St Paul's flew through a wall half a mile away where 2 seamstresses were sitting, this piece of rock whizzed between them. They were told they couldn't use any more explosives to demolish it. They had to do it with pickaxes and hammers. Just think, Wren is probably the first person in Britain to have built a cathedral and seen it through to the end. It took 35 years.
It took a long time.
But compared to Gloucester or Durham or any of the others, that's only half a lifetime.
The fire also ravaged 89 churches and 13,200 houses, leading to what you call the most miraculous church building project of the Middle Ages. Is it right to call them Wren's churches?
Absolutely it is. But I know where you're coming from here. There is a big but. Wren is the head of an administrative works. He designs some of the churches. He actually designs the high-status churches. He designs St James Piccadilly. He designs St Stephen of Walbrook, which I know you're not supposed to have favourites, but that is the best church in the world.
I agree.
Others, Hook, or the various other builders on the commission, they're involved. But there's a wonderful drawing of the facade of St Edmund, King and Martyr in Lombard Street, Wren Church. That drawing is by Robert Hooke. I know it's by Robert Hooke. I know Hooke's hand. And clearly Robert Hooke was doing the designing. In the pediment of that entrance facade, there's a little squiggle. And if you magnify the little squiggle, it's a CW for Christopher Wren.
No way.
He's actually signing off the designs. And that's what he's doing. He's in charge of a massive building project. People argue about the number. There's actually something like 56 new churches. There were 109 in the city originally. 80-odd of them burned. Some of them, it's not worth putting back. Even in the 1660s and 70s, they don't have congregations. So congregations merge. But Wren is responsible for 56 of them. He probably individually designed a handful, 10. maybe. But still, without him, it wouldn't have been built.
Right. So he is the one overseeing the entire project, and the buck absolutely stops with him.
He's Norman Foster. Norman Foster's not there at his drawing board doing every single detail. He's got a team.
Norman Foster, of course, needs no introduction. He was an incredible architect and comparable to Wren. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. Now, we would have thought that Wren was busy enough as he was, but at this stage, he's actually promoted to Surveyor General of the King's Works, and he's an MP for Devon as well. Was he the right man for these positions, do you think, considering everything he had going on?
History says he was. But with hindsight, it's still not clear how he became Surveyor General of the Works. The Surveyor General was Sir John Denham, who was a great poet, but not an architect, not a builder at all, and who in fact went bonkers. And after he appeared in Charles II's bedchamber saying he was the Holy Spirit come to judge him, they thought he probably ought to take a holiday, which he did and promptly died. I mean, John Webb was all set to become Surveyor General. John Webb, Inigo Jones's nephew by marriage and assistant, was probably the best qualified modern architect. And Webb was convinced he was going to get the job. And somehow Wren gets it. We don't know how. Presumably there was intervention for the church through his influential church contacts. He's on good terms with Charles II. The interesting thing is he becomes Surveyor General in 1669. He doesn't give up the day job. He has the most influential architectural job in Britain, and he doesn't give up the job as Professor of Astronomy because he's not sure if he's going to like being Surveyor General. He does both. He just seems to accumulate positions. Yeah, he's head of the Commission for Rebuilding City Churches. He's the architect of St Paul's. He's a Professor of Astronomy. And now he's Surveyor of the King's Works with responsibility for all the palaces. It's impossible. How can one bloke do that? He does, and he does it with ease. Amazing, really amazing. Let's think about some of Wren's secular work. There was the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, the Whitehall, the Royal Apartments at Hampton Court, and of course Kensington Palace. You know, were these projects as challenging as St Paul's, and do you get the impression that he actually enjoyed them and that he was proud of them? He was frustrated by all of them, I think. Whitehall he wanted to pull down and rebuild. One thing, just let me throw in here, just to remind everyone that although we think of Wren as the great exponent of English Baroque, he thought of himself as a classicist. He's rebuilding ancient Rome, and most of his designs he regarded as classical designs. So he wanted to build a classical Palace of Whitehall. He wanted to knock down all those boring Tudor bits at Hampton Court and put a nice big new palace in, a shiny new palace. William and Mary, predominantly William, decided he hadn't got the cash and he was only allowed to do the Royal Apartments in the South Front. His masterpiece, in palace terms, would have been Winchester. In 1680, Charles II decides he wants to relocate out of London and to have a brand new palace in hunting country about a mile outside Winchester. He tells Wren to hurry up because he's not long for this world. And Wren does hurry. But in 1685, when the king has a stroke and dies, Winchester still isn't completed. James II is not so keen, and it's never finished. Whitehall doesn't work for him, Hampton Court doesn't work for him, Winchester doesn't work for him. I think he was frustrated all the way along the line with those royal buildings. So he's never been able to create the great vision. He had it at St Paul's, but again, he was thwarted in the actual scale of his ambition, in the scale of his actual vision, which I think he thinks other people just can't see. And more importantly, they can't pay for. It's too expensive. Yeah, I think that's a very fair way to look at it. He's strongest when he's up against it. That's one thing, I think. But he's strongest when he does have a problem, whether it's a structural problem or a political problem, when he's got a problem that he can solve or that he's invited to find a solution for. That's when he's at his best. One of the many problems at St Paul's is how to build a dome. People haven't done domes in England at that time. And the example that most people know about is that how to put a 300-ton cupola on top of the dome of St Paul's without it crushing it. He does a double or treble skinned dome to support that cupola. He's not always right. There are a couple of moments that I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when Wren was working. One is with St Paul's almost finished, and he's taken down into the crypt where the entire superstructure of the dome, which weighs as much as a fully laden Titanic, is resting on 8 pillars. And he's taken down into the crypt by one of the building contractors and shown that those pillars are bursting. What do? It's too late to rebuild it. What he does is wrap them in bands of iron and hope for the best.
That's unbelievable.
I'd love to have seen the look on his face, though. The other moment I would love to have been there is towards the end of Wren's life, when he's walked away from St Paul's with it not quite finished. He falls out with the dean and chapter. He becomes a very crotchety old man. And the dean and chapter send a member of the St Paul's Commission round to Wren's house to discuss completing the railings on the roof. Trivial thing. The chap they send round is Isaac Newton. You've got Isaac Newton and Christopher Wren sitting across a table discussing the finishing St Paul's Cathedral. God, what a day that was. What an event.
It would have been amazing to have been a fly on the wall.
Amazing.
It would have been one of those moments to remind us of how special this time was, and that history isn't just a process, and that there were brilliant people in the wings doing unbelievable feats. Can I just ask you about Wren's personal life and how little we know about it? Wren's, religious beliefs. We talked a little bit about that at the beginning of the podcast, where we say that his family were high church. Listeners, just in case you don't know what that means, the term high church actually refers to beliefs and practices of Christians of ecclesiology and liturgy and theology that actually emphasize ritual, priestly authority, and the sacraments. Although used in common connection with, the various Christian traditions, the term actually originated has been primarily associated with the Anglican tradition, where it describes churches using a number of, ritual practices associated in the popular mind with Roman Catholicism and I guess also Eastern Orthodoxy. Other contemporary denominations that contain, high church wings include some Lutheran and Presbyterian and Methodist churches. So Wren's family were high church, and we know that Wren was also pro-monarch. Is it actually possible to discern anything about his spirituality from his architectural work?
I see him as a very conventional Anglican. His religious beliefs aren't revolutionary, but they're part of who he is, as they were for most people of his generation and his background. And his faith, I'm sure, was completely orthodox, completely conventional, and total. I don't think he saw science and religion conflicting with each other at all. I think that's quite an important point, because others were worried. He just didn't see it as an issue. It was another way of celebrating and understanding God. But you talk about his personal life, and that does get really difficult, I think. He's married twice, Faith Coghill and Jane Fitzwilliam. He's only married for, 6 years out of 93 years? He's not a sort of jolly family chap. He spends most of his leisure time in the coffee houses around the West End of London. That's where he socialises. That's where he does a lot of his work as well. He sees contractors in coffee houses. He does deals. He has progress reports. His private life and his professional life seem to me to be one. There's not a distinction between them in lots of ways. He does have children. He's devoted to his daughter, Jane, who dies quite young. He has a son, Christopher, who he wants to inherit from him. He tries to ensure that Christopher will become Surveyor General of the Works, which doesn't happen. Christopher's not got the temperament nor the talent. He has another son, William. There's something wrong with William. We don't know what it is. There's a chance reference in a letter to him taking care of poor Billy, to young Christopher Jr. People have suggested that he may have had a mental handicap. We don't know. We're just guessing. He lives a life of the mind. He's not a jolly chap by a long way. There's a remarkable bust by Edward Pearce, one of the contractors who worked on St Paul's. The bust of Christopher Wren in the Ashmolean. And it's the Christopher Wren that I think I know as far as I can know anyone. And he's got a slight smile on his lips, and he's looking over your shoulder, and you just get this sense that he can see farther than you can. He saw further.
Was his unique skill as an architect and the vision that he had actually appreciated during his lifetime?
I don't think he ever had the recognition that he thought he deserved. And towards the end of his life, of course, he had quite the reverse. To be honest, the habit of power got too great with him. He should have gone, and he couldn't. He's been arbiter of architectural taste for 50 years nearly. When George I comes to the throne and a shady crook called William Benson persuades George I to sack Wren, and Wren's fallen out with the authorities at St Paul's, he's a grumpy old man. And that's when he says he wishes he hadn't wasted his life in rubbish, in building.
That's very sad, I think.
Because he feels that he's being neglected. He feels he's being rejected. He's being left behind. And of course he is. You know, when the scaffolding came down on St Paul's, Lord Burlington said something about when Solomon saw the temple he wept. The Palladians are moving in. Wren's the old school. Wren's the old guard. He's an absolutist. His time has passed by the time St Paul's is built. And he was too wedded to power, I think, to realise that. He wouldn't be the only one, would he? It happens.
The challenge of staying nimble, I suppose, staying up to date and ahead of the time as one ages.
Yeah.
Wren died 300 years ago this year, and I saw that there was a service to mark the day that he died in St. Paul's, and that then made me wonder when Wren actually became a significant figure in Britain's national consciousness. Did that happen when he was alive, or is it something that happened as we started to appreciate the length and breadth of his achievements and his works? I'll also never forget that iconic image of St. Paul's, you know, the photograph that was taken during the Blitz with the smoke swirling around, you know, St. Paul's Cathedral just after a bombing had taken place.
Yeah, it's a gradual thing, I think. Wren, like every other Baroque architect, drops massively out of fashion in the 18th century, along with Vanbrugh, along with William Talman, the architect of Chatsworth. They are disregarded. They are yesterday's men. Then in 1823, the centenary of Wren's death, we have a sort of flurry of publications. By 1923, Wren is distinctly fashionable. And you're right, it is St Paul's. Even before that famous photograph of St Paul's standing proud, wreathed in smoke in the middle of the Blitz, in the early 1900s, St Paul's is being called the parish church of Empire. It's where Nelson is buried. It rivals Westminster Abbey as the place where our statesmen are memorialised and are buried. By the end of the 19th century, you've got an architectural revival of early Georgian styles, which is called the Renaissance, with a W.
I love that.
And it's basically building mini Hampton Courts. They're beautiful buildings. So Wren is being rehabilitated. 1923, the authorities launch a massive appeal for funds on the back of the bicentenary, which actually moves things along, which moves Wren's opinion. But St Paul's, more than anything else, that's where George VI launches the Festival of Britain from in 1951. That's where Charles and Diana begin their doomed fairy tale wedding. It's a lot more than just London's Cathedral.
Yeah, of course. That's one of those days where everyone remembers where they were. I actually had a job as a piano mover, and I was helping carry a baby grand that day up 8 flights of stairs. So St. Paul's, out of everything that he built, has remained central to the popular imagination. And I'm glad that we were able to bring that to light, but I'm also conscious that St. Paul's wasn't exactly what he wanted, that he wanted something more grand. And although listening to you, I get the feeling that this was really quite an amazing feat, and obviously nothing had been built like it. It was a vision like no other. Still, in the end, he wasn't able to do what he wanted to do.
Is any of us ever satisfied? And certainly, is any creative ever satisfied? Does what they make ever fit the vision of what they could make? I don't think Wren is unusual in that. Where he is unusual is in the extent of his creativity, the vast vision. He is, without doubt, Britain's greatest architect. Nobody comes close. And it's interesting, I think, that in a society which we don't value our architects particularly, and there's only a handful that the person in the street can just name. Everybody's heard of Christopher Wren, and that's not a bad epitaph.
This is true. Thank you so much for coming on the show and for talking to me about Wren. And I'd like to remind people of your book, His Inventions So Fertile, A Life of Christopher Wren. It would make an amazing Christmas present. And there is so much more in the book that we haven't actually talked about today. It's a fascinating read. Thank you for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening in, folks. Bye for now.